Edinburgh, seat of the Scottish Enlightenment, capital of the country, and home to hundreds of thousands of women, including Linda McDonald. Linda is part of the historic re-enactment group Edinburgh Living History, based primarily in Lauriston Castle. Linda and her team have been researching some of the women that have lived in the castle over the years with a view to staging a live event in the future. Linda, along with group members Chris Pearson, David Fisher and Gordon Roberts, have been looking into the history, discovering that in the castle's 400 years there have only been 3 women owners, although other women lived there as wives and daughters of male owners. Those male owners are very well recorded, with portraits, photographs and information easily attainable, but with the exception of the last woman to live there, Margaret Reid, there is very little about those previous female occupants. I went to the City Art Centre in central Edinburgh with my team to sit down with Linda and hers to find out what they'd been researching, what they'd been finding out, and what they wanted to share with us to celebrate the Ladies of Lauriston. First up, I'm interviewing Gordon Roberts to meet our first historic woman. Thanks for letting me join you today. And we're kicking off with our earliest Lady of Lauriston, Jean Campbell Law. What can you tell us about her?
Well, Jean Campbell Law, from what we know about her, was the second daughter of an Edinburgh merchant who possibly was part of the Campbell family from the Dukes of Argyll, but it's uncertain. She was born sometime about 1639. They lived in Edinburgh. She was the second of 4 daughters. The 4 daughters all married very well. She married William Law, who was a goldsmith in Edinburgh. And she was his second wife, his first wife, having died in giving birth to their son George. And it seems likely that William was in need of a wife to look after his son. So they married about a year after the death of the birth of the child. So it was a fairly quick marriage. But seems to have been quite a successful one, because they, between them, had 9 children, one of whom died in infancy, but the 8 others all survived. Unfortunately, George, the one who she inherited, didn't. He died as well.
How did Jean come to be the owner of Lauriston Castle?
Well, her husband, if you know, at the time, being a goldsmith, and William Law was a goldsmith, was very prestigious. For example, if you think about it, probably the best known goldsmith of that period was George Harriet, who made a vast amount of money and was able to endow an orphanage, which is now a famous school. So being a goldsmith meant that you had a chance of becoming quite wealthy. Obviously, you'd have to be pretty good at your job. He had a business attached to the back of St Giles. He started there. Goldsmiths had a prestigious position because they were granted the rights by the Presbyterian Church to make all the plate and cups and things for all the churches in Scotland. So that was quite a good source of revenue. So much so that William was able to buy another property, and they moved into a house in Parliament Close. Eventually, he bought the land at Lauriston, which basically was the house and all the fields and things that ran down to the Forth and down to Cramond. So it was a large amount of land. Now, he didn't intend to live there. What he did was he rented it out. And part of the agreement when he rented it was that on his death, his wife would be responsible for looking after it until the children were old enough to inherit. Unfortunately, he died the year after he bought the property. It's not quite clear what happened, but he went to Paris for some sort of surgery, possibly gallstones, but he died there. And the business was left in the hands of Jean.
Was that common for a woman to take over the business at the time?
Well, I can only give the example of our family where there were 3 girls who married Edinburgh businessmen, and when they died, they all took over the businesses and made a good job of it. One of them indeed her husband was a bookseller, a bookmaker, and he had the right to make all the Bibles in Scotland. He had a special dispensation for that. And when he died, she took that over. I've got to say that from the reports are that those Bibles were not particularly accurate, but she certainly she had that job. And Jean continued not only as looking after the rents, but also as a moneylender, because that's what, in a way, that's what banking, Goldsmith became a banking and became money lending and things like that, and she dealt in that.
So was she very involved at the castle? Do we know much about that?
Well, as far as we can tell, I wouldn't have thought she paid very many visits there, although because it was the rent they would be collected, she would probably have gone on some occasions, but there's no evidence of her ever being there. That's the problem.
What other challenges did she face?
Well, she had problems with her son, the famous John Law, who's probably the character who's most well known in connection with Lauriston, although like his mother, there's little evidence that he was ever there, although he carried the name John Law of Lauriston all through his life. She had trouble with him since he was the eldest son, and he was due to inherit. But when he was a boy, he he started a gambling habit. And by the age of 16, we're not quite sure whether he walked out or whether his mother threw him out, but he was no longer part of the family, and as a result of that, he took his mother to court under what is called a writ of aliment. Now that says that a parent is responsible for looking after their child until the age of 17, and he said, I'm only 16, so he was trying to get the money that he should have been getting from his mother. She took him to court in return, and in her dispensation to the court, she said, my eldest son, without any offence or provocation, has lately deserted my family, contrary to the will of his father. It is most just that he should return to my family, not only because of his said father's will, but also that I may have the better opportunity to oversee his behaviour night and day, that it is blameless and decent. And the true cause of his deserting of my family was because of my motherly reprehending him for biding late out at night and going to the lottery and other games. So as you can see, like most teenagers, mother and son had problems. The case was settled out of court. At the age of 21, he demanded his share of the estate. Now, they couldn't give him the land, so he was given bonds instead, and he used those bonds to pay off his debts. He went on down to London, where he had led a life of dissipation, got himself into a duel, killed somebody, was charged with murder, was sent to prison, escaped from prison, was banished. Eventually, the Queen Anne, pardoned him, but he never really returned to Edinburgh. He made his peace with his mother, and she restored the lands to him, the Lauriston lands to him, but he doesn't seem to have looked after it, and he left it in the care of his younger brother, William.
How does Jean's story end?
She still conducted her money lending business until she was in her 60s, but she died in 1707. Don't know why, don't know how, but she was buried in the Greyfriars churchyard. Unfortunately, there's no indication of where the grave is. And it's rather a condemnation of the son that he never bothered to put up a monument to his mother. So I must say, an admirable woman, I think, a strong woman. Her connection with Lauriston is small, but she owned the lands, and she took the rents and looked after it. She brought up 8 children. She continued a business. Remarkable woman.
Gordon, thank you. Now it's time to meet Linda, who has a wealth of knowledge and research galore with her. Linda, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
You're going to be telling us about Harriet Elizabeth Allen. Who is she?
Well, Harriet was the daughter of Thomas Allen, who bought the castle from the Law family. We don't know really who actually lived in the castle during the time of the Laws, because as Gordon has already told you, they rented it out for most of that time. But we do know that Thomas Allen bought the castle for his family. Now, Harriet was the oldest of 5 siblings, but unfortunately her mother, Christian, died when Harriet was only 9 years old. And when she was 15 years old, she, her father, and her 4 younger siblings all moved into Lauriston Castle.
What was the castle like when they bought it?
Well, it was still a tower house, as it had been when the Laws had owned it. And Thomas Allen then embarked on a huge renovation programme. They didn't knock down the old tower house, but they added on a big wing, which was over 2 floors and included a dining room, 2 reception rooms, bedrooms, kitchen. So he made it into a very nice house and home for the family to live in. And when Harriet was just 15, she moved into the house with her father and her 4 younger siblings. So it would appear that she would take on the role of mistress of the home, and she would be presiding perhaps over some of the visits of some illustrious guests.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. Who do you think was their most famous guest?
Well, the most famous guest that we are aware of is Sir Walter Scott. He went to visit Lauriston Castle with Thomas Allen in 1827, and it is recorded in his diary that he made that visit and that he said it was a very comfortable home for the family to live in. He seemed to be impressed. And in my imagination, I have imagined Harriet presiding perhaps over afternoon tea in the newly converted sitting room or drawing room, which must have been a very interesting occasion. Her father, Thomas Allen, was a very interesting gentleman in his own right. He was a banker. He was the owner of the Caledonian Mercury, a local newspaper, and he was really very interested in mineralogy. And he had a vast collection of his stones actually in Lauriston Castle. This collection, I believe, was later sold to the British Museum, so we can see that it was a prestigious collection. So although Harriet would, when she was 15 or 16, her formal education would have come to an end, because as a girl, she would have had no way or right to go to any kind of higher education. But there was a lot for her to learn and read about in the castle itself.
Now, I know there were some happy occasions for Harriet at the castle, and one in particular was her wedding. What was that like?
According to the Caledonian Mercury, she married a gentleman called David Smith, who unfortunately I haven't been able to find out any more information about him as yet. We obviously don't really know what the wedding looked like or exactly which room it took place in, but I can imagine the newly built staircase perhaps being decorated with flowers from their extensive gardens, and perhaps the ceremony may have been in the hallway. And I can imagine Thomas Allen as a very proud father. Remember, he was a widower, but he would be welcoming some perhaps quite important people from society to the wedding of his eldest daughter, Harriet, in Lauriston Castle.
Was it a long and happy marriage at the castle?
Sadly, a few years after her wedding, Thomas Allen died, and the castle was passed on to his eldest son. obviously Harriet's younger brother or younger sibling, but as it was custom in those days, she didn't inherit the building. It went on to her brother, who sadly then sold the castle to the Royal Bank. And we also know that Harriet unfortunately died at the very young age of 30, just a few years really after her wedding. We really just know from the Caledonian Mercury paper the announcement of her death. But we do know it was in Hatfield House, which is in Herefordshire. And again, we have to use imagination here, but I like to think of her living her last days in another beautiful home.
She sounds like a really interesting person.
I think she was.
And certainly wonderful having the wedding there.
Yes, and to have been the mistress of the house of Lauriston Castle at such a young age, I think it's important that her story should be told.
Linda, thank you. We'll definitely talk more soon. Moving ever forward in time, we're now joined by David Fisher to talk about the wonderfully named Mary Stirling Sandilands Ramsay.
Yes.
David, can you tell us about her?
Unfortunately, like so many women of the past, we actually know very, very little about her. Much more about her husband, father, brother, son, etc. But she was born Mary Sandilands in Dunblane, Scotland. Her father was the 10th Lord Torthicon, and his wife, her mother obviously, Mary Douglas Stirling. She was born in January the 30th, 1811. In August 1828, at the age of 17, she married William Ramsay Esquire. His father was also called William Ramsay, so to distinguish them, his father gave him the double name of Ramsay. He was of Barton House, a very wealthy local landowner, said to be the wealthiest commoner in Scotland, which, bearing in mind how much the aristocracy actually owned it, don't know how wealthy that is or isn't. William was said to be a born sportsman. He was the master of the Linlithgow and Stirlingshire Hunt and owned several famous racehorses. He's said to have ridden his horse up the very grand, splendid staircase of Barton House.
So what was their life like at Lauriston?
I'm not sure how much time they actually spent there, but he actually purchased the estate in 1835. His principal aim really was apparently to acquire 3 fields that were on the other side of Cramond Road South, so he could bring them into his estate to sort of tidy it up.
Like with some of the previous women we've learned about, she had her share of tragedy at the castle, a misadventure of a relative, I believe.
Her cousin Patrick Stirling, 24-year-old, in 1839, William and Patrick had gone to one of the fields looking at one of the older properties on the estate. Patrick had put a ladder up at the side of an old gable, which, when he reached the top, gave way. And he, jumping from the ladder, falling onto the ground or the debris, basically was very seriously injured. And he was taken across to Lauriston Castle, where the following day he died.
How long did Mary live at Lauriston for? We know some owners didn't even stay there, did she?
Well, 3 years later, in 1842, the family actually sold the castle to Andrew Rutherford. And following the death of Patrick, they actually had allowed people, friends, to reside in the castle, Lauriston Castle.
So they let it out to friends?
I don't know if it's let out or it's just described as their friends were allowed to live there. In 1844, 2 years after they sold Lauriston, Mary gave birth to their only son, Charles William Ramsay. I don't know if she had other children or not, because it's a very long time after they first married to conceive their first child. But he survived anyway. Again, we don't know very much about the relationship between William and Mary, but we do know that he had at least one extramarital affair. 1847, an illegitimate daughter, also called Mary, was born, whose mother is recorded as being Mary Bonner, a coal miner's widow.
So he had a thing for Marys?
It appears so, but whether there's other Catherines, etc., we don't really know. William died in 1850 at the age of 40, leaving Mary a widowed single mother. She raised her son Charles with the help of an unmarried brother James at Barton House. Like his father, he was an avid sportsman and died tragically in an accident in 1865 at the age of 21. By 1871, 6 years later, Mary was living with her brother James in Hanover Square area of London. By the sound of it, in some comfort, they had at least a dozen live-in servants. And she died in 1891 at the age of 79.
Not bad innings.
Very good innings, yes.
Thank you, David. Sofia Rutherford is our next woman, and Linda, I want you to tell me all about her.
I will do. So Sophia Frances Stuart Rutherford was born in 1792 into a rather influential Irish political family. And at the age of 30, in 1822, she married Lord Andrew Greenfield Rutherford, who was to become one of Edinburgh's most well-established political figures and was the Solicitor General. They bought Lauriston Castle as a country home in 1842 from William Ramsay, who you've been hearing about. So they too made some changes to Lauriston Castle, particularly in the exterior of the building, including the addition of this porchway with the Rutherford family crest engraved in stone above the doorway. The translation of the Latin is "from sea to land," and it's popular with visitors who come to look at the castle in modern days. Now, Sophia and Andrew Rutherford also spent time and money decorating and furnishing the interior of the house, and it was in fact described as in a leading journal of the time as, I quote, "Everything was in keeping, and a desirable residence for a man of fortune could hardly be desired." I think it more than likely that Sophia and Andrew would do some entertaining at their summer residence at Lauriston Castle. Given the political background of both Sophia and Andrew, that they would have done quite a lot of entertaining in Lauriston Castle. And it is intriguing to imagine the conversations around the dining table at the middle of the 19th century. It also seems that this couple, who didn't have any children, had a very close and loving relationship. And it is also said that when Sophia realised that she was dying, she wrote a poignant letter to her husband, only to be delivered to him after she had died. Sophia sadly died in her bedroom in Lauriston Castle on the 10th of October, 1852. And it also appears that Andrew Rutherford never fully recovered from the death of his dear wife, and he himself died just 2 years later. And on the elaborate tomb in which the couple are buried in the Dean Cemetery, he had inscribed the following words: "Andrew Rutherford, surviving against his will, placed this tomb in mourning to his most beloved wife and to himself in 1852. So perhaps, however, that this is not the end of the story for Sophia Rutherford, as at least one staff member of Lauriston Castle has reported sensing the presence of a lady from years ago, swishing in her silks across the floor of the castle, making her way from the bedroom to the sitting room. Could this be Sophia?
Love a good ghost story. Our next woman, well, I think for me at least, she's one of the more controversial but also free-spirited. Let me get this right. Margaret Gordon Macpherson Grant.
Yes, well done. She was born Margaret Gordon Macpherson. We'll explain about the Grant in due course. And she was born in Aberlour in Scotland in 1834. Her only brother, Alexander, sadly died at a young age, leaving Margaret to be the sole heir of her parents. And then in 1854, her maternal uncle, Alexander Grant, died unmarried and childless. He chose to leave his fortune to his niece Margaret as his sole heir on the one condition that she changed her name to Grant. So, how had Alexander Grant amassed this fortune? Well, he had amassed his fortune through the exploitation of enslaved Africans on plantations in Jamaica. And although slavery had been abolished by now, Grant continued to profit from the so-called compensation which the government paid to the plantation owners. Margaret used some of the money to purchase Lauriston Castle, primarily as a home for her father in 1859 after her mother had passed away. But Margaret is recorded as living in the castle in the 1861 census with her father and 12 servants.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. However, we do have to remember the size of the house. Remember how it had been extended into this huge mansion house, and there were a lot of grounds and very lovely gardens to be maintained. Margaret herself was apparently very interested in dairy work, so much so that she had constructed a model dairy in the grounds of the castle. And we can still see that there. It's been preserved really well. But unfortunately, I don't really have any more information about how the dairy actually worked. I think it would be fair to say that Margaret was to live an unconventional life for a lady of the Victorian era. She was described by some of the local newspapers of the day, and I am quoting again, as dressing in a manly fashion. And from 1864, she was apparently engaged in a same-sex relationship with an English lady called Charlotte Temple. Charlotte was to wear a ring on her wedding finger and referred often to Margaret as her wife. The couple mainly lived together in their home in the north of Scotland. Unfortunately, Margaret suffered from depression and chronic alcoholism, which was to get worse after her father's death. He died in 1871 and Margaret sold the castle on. And 4 years later, Charlotte Temple became engaged to Captain Harry Yeatman, and that obviously would have a detrimental effect on Margaret's mental health, and indeed her drinking apparently got much worse. She sadly died just a few days short of her 43rd birthday as a result of paralysis and apoplexy, and with complications due to her excessive drinking and depression. Although Margaret was involved in many philanthropic causes throughout her lifetime, the story of her life proves that the fortune which had been amassed through the suffering of others didn't bring any happiness.
Well, thank you, Linda. Finally, we move on to the most recent occupant of Lauriston Castle. Margaret Reid lived in Lauriston Castle with her husband William and her brother, also called William, the three of them being the final private owners. And to tell us about Margaret, we have Chris Pearson. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
So we come to our final lady, the last private owner, and it's the one we know the most about, don't we?
Yes, Margaret Reid, born Margaret Johnston Barton. Along with her husband, William Reid, they were the last private owners of the castle from 1903 onwards.
Before she came to Lauriston Castle, she had something of an adventurous youth, didn't she?
She grew up in the family home on Glenorchy Terrace in the Mayfield district of Edinburgh, and she seems to have led quite a full and adventurous life. She, for example, studied physiology with the Edinburgh Ladies Educational Association, where one of the other students at the time was Elsie Ingalls, the pioneering doctor and suffragist. She's known to have travelled quite a bit. We're aware certainly that she travelled to Canada and the United States visiting relations. And then a few years later, she also made a trip to North Africa.
She also, I understand, spoke another language.
Indeed, yes, several languages. In fact, the main one of which was Italian. She became a member of the Scoto-Italian Society of Edinburgh. And she was also a member of the Edinburgh Photographic Society. Several of her submissions to their annual exhibition are still can still be seen at Lauriston Castle.
The Reeds, they were quite different to the previous owners, weren't they?
They were rather unusual among the occupants of the castle, I think, in that they were not the nobility or the landed gentry. Both of them came from families who had made their money in trade, as the Victorians would rather snobbishly have said.
So they came to the castle through business, no inheritance, no questionable overseas practices, just hard work.
Absolutely, yes. This was family wealth. William Reid was part of the firm of Morrison and Co. furniture makers, which had been founded by his grandfather. And Mrs. Reid, Miss Barton, was the third daughter of William Barton, who had founded the firm of Barton and Sons Sanitary Engineers, and done very nicely out of it. When they finally bought the castle in 1903, they spent some time renovating it. It appears to have deteriorated quite badly. If you look back at the records, around a century earlier, it had been sold for £27,000, and Mr. Reid bought it for only £9,000. So they did a great deal of renovation on it, including installing electric lighting and central heating, which was, of course, installed by the Barton family business.
We know that her brother William died first on a trip to London. How long did Mr. and Mrs. Reid remain at the castle after?
Well, Mr. Reid died at the age of 64 in 1919. Mrs. Reid stayed on, and although her own health was deteriorating, she was still able to be quite active. She was, for example, elected to the Scottish Society of Antiquaries in 1922, and in 1925 she was principal guest at an official luncheon at the City Chambers. It's believed that this is where she discussed with the Lord Provost of the time the plan to donate Lauriston Castle to the nation.
Gifting the castle to the people of Scotland was something to happen on the death of the last remaining occupant, that would be Mrs. Reid herself. When did she eventually pass?
The very next year, 1926. Part of the condition of the will was that Lauriston Castle should be maintained in the state it was at her death, which is why if you go now you see the house of a wealthy family as it would have been in 1926.
Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
These then are a few of the women who owned or lived in Lauriston. But there have been many, many more. The women we've talked about have left a trace, in some cases a very small one. But we know little of the many other mothers, wives, daughters who lived at Lauriston, and almost nothing about the multitude of servants, most of them female, who worked in the house. Women have been mostly overlooked in the history of Lauriston, not because they contributed nothing to the house, but because their roles have been almost taken for granted. Wives supported husbands, daughters got married and had children. Women in general were responsible for the running of the house. By drawing attention to these 6 ladies, we hope to have shown that houses such as Lauriston would not have flourished without the input of women, and they deserve their historical recognition for it.
I want to thank the members of Edinburgh Living History for joining me to talk about their ongoing research into the Ladies of Lauriston. We hope that this programme has gone some way to illuminating their past. I'm Rebecca Hale.